In the late spring of 1944, inside a medieval chateau on the Seine called La Roche-Guyon, the staff of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel worked over their charts of the French coast. Rommel had moved his Army Group B headquarters into the chateau in February of that year. From its rooms, his officers planned the defense of the most important stretch of coastline in the European war. They worked from a mixture of pre-war French civilian maps, captured Allied tourist sheets, and German military overlays. Their picture of the ground beyond the beaches was approximate, dated, and increasingly out of step with the reality their enemy was photographing. Far above the chateau, almost silent in the thin upper air, an unarmed twin-engine aircraft of the United States Army Air Forces was crossing the French coast at over 20,000 feet. It was painted a deep blue, the high-altitude camouflage scheme then in use over Europe. In its nose, cameras worked in steady rhythm, exposing 9-inch square negatives every few seconds. The pilot wore an oxygen mask and a heated flying suit. He carried no guns, he carried film. By the time the German staff at La Roche-Guyon finished their morning conference, the aircraft was already turning north toward the English Channel. By nightfall, its film would be in a dark room at an airfield in Oxfordshire. By breakfast the following morning, photo interpreters in a country house called Danesfield would be reading the German defensive plan in a level of detail that the German staff did not themselves possess. This is the story of why the German General Staff, the most professional military planning body in Europe, ended the war fighting half-blind, while their enemies could see almost everything they did. It is the story of cameras, of cellulose film, of trimetragon mounts, of 70 million map sheets, of one young woman with a stereoscope, and of an asymmetry of vision that helped decide the largest war in human history. The aircraft above the chateau was a Lockheed F-5 Lightning, the photographic version of the famous P-38 fighter. Of the roughly 10,000 P-38 airframes built during the war, more than 1,200 were completed or converted as F-4 or F-5 photo variants. They carried no machine guns and no cannon. The 4 gun bays in the nose were instead filled with cameras, lenses, and film magazines. They flew higher than most German fighters could climb, and faster than most German fighters could catch. The cameras inside an F-5 could be configured in several ways depending on the mission. For tactical photo reconnaissance, a typical fit was 3 to 5 cameras combining a vertical pair for stereoscopic coverage, with 1 or 2 oblique cameras for context. For dedicated photographic mapping, a different configuration was used. This was the trimetragon mount, a system developed by the United States for the systematic mapping of large or poorly charted regions. 1 camera pointed straight down, 2 more were tilted 60 degrees off vertical, 1 to the left and 1 to the right. With every shutter trip, the 3 lenses together captured a continuous strip of ground from horizon to horizon. At a flying height of 20,000 feet, the trimetragon prints showed the world at a scale of 1 to 40,000, with 60% forward overlap and 30% side overlap. The forward overlap was the secret. It allowed any 2 consecutive vertical prints to be viewed through a stereoscope, fused into a single 3-dimensional image. In that image, a tank's track marks, a freshly dug gun pit, or a camouflage net laid badly over a fuel dump would stand out as cleanly as a model on a tabletop. The trimetragon system, mounted in F-5 Lightnings configured for mapping work and in dedicated mapping aircraft like the F-7 and the F-9, gave the United States the ability to map vast areas at a pace and scale Germany could never match. The cameras themselves had names that meant nothing outside their own world. The Fairchild K-17, the K-18, the Son continuous strip camera, which synchronized its film velocity to the aircraft's ground speed and produced a single seamless ribbon of imagery beneath a low-flying plane. The Type F, 5.2 36-inch reconnaissance camera used by the Royal Air Force on long-distance mosquito sorties. Behind every camera was a logistic chain that produced film by the mile, and a darkroom complex that printed the negatives by the 100,000. The men who flew these missions carried no weapons because weapons were weight, and weight was altitude, and altitude was life. They were trained to climb, to photograph, and to run. They were told to bring back the film at all costs. The film, not the pilot, was what mattered. To understand why this American and British photographic apparatus had become so vast by 1944, you have to go back to 1938. Before the war began, The pioneer was not a uniformed officer. He was an Australian businessman and aviator named Sidney Cotton. In the autumn of 1938, French military intelligence approached him to fly civilian Lockheed aircraft over Germany under commercial cover, photographing rearmament installations through hidden hatches in the floor. In April 1939, Frederick Winterbotham of the British Secret Intelligence Service recruited him as well. For the better part of a year, Cotton ran a private intelligence flying operation for two governments at once. He pioneered, for the British, the use of warm cabin air to defog cameras at altitude, an idea that solved one of the great problems of high-altitude photography. He developed a 3-camera installation, one vertical and 2 slightly oblique, that anticipated the later trimetragon by several years. He flew over Berlin while German officials were still issuing him visas. Cotton's most important insight was that the existing Royal Air Force reconnaissance doctrine was wrong. The Royal Air Force at the start of the war flew reconnaissance in slow, lightly armed aircraft like the Bristol Blenheim, often at low altitude, escorted by fighters. Cotton argued that the future belonged to fast, unarmed, high-flying aircraft, painted in pale colors that would simply outrun anything that tried to intercept them. He acquired a handful of Supermarine Spitfires, stripped out their guns and armor, polished the wings to reduce drag, and painted them a duck-egg blue-green he called camo tint. The aircraft climbed to 30,000 feet. They approached 400 miles per hour in level flight. They came home with film. The Royal Air Force had insisted such missions would be impossible. Cotton proved otherwise within weeks. When war broke out in September 1939, Cotton's private intelligence operation was absorbed into the Royal Air Force as the Photographic Development Unit, based first at RAF Heston, then at RAF Benson. The interpretation effort, the work of turning negatives into intelligence, was given a separate home. In April 1941, the photographic interpreters moved to an Edwardian country house called Danesfield, built in the Tudor Revival style on a chalk bluff above the Thames, near the village of Medmenham in Buckinghamshire. From that month forward, RAF Medmenham was the brain of Allied photo intelligence in Europe. The choice of a country house was deliberate. The interpreters needed quiet. They needed long working hours under blackout conditions. They needed dark rooms, plotting rooms, and model-making workshops. Above all, they needed scale. The grounds of Danesfield could absorb the wooden huts that, by 1944, would house thousands of officers, enlisted men and women, civilian scientists, geologists, archaeologists, geographers, and linguists, all working in shifts that ran around the clock. The interpreters slept in nearby villages and were bussed to work. The films arrived from a dozen forward airfields, by motorcycle dispatch rider, by light aircraft, and by lorry. The work never stopped. It began with a few hundred officers and enlisted personnel, and grew steadily through the war years. In May of 1944, in recognition of the heavy American presence, the unit was formally renamed the Allied Central Interpretation Unit. Its sections were organized by subject. There was a section for shipping, a section for railways, a section for industry, a section for radar and wireless, a section for aircraft and new weapons, designated L section. And there was a section that, by the spring of 1944, was running the most consequential intelligence hunt of the European war. Its codename was Operation Crossbow. It was searching for Adolf Hitler's secret weapons. The American contribution arrived in scale during 1943. The 7th Photographic Reconnaissance Group of the 8th Air Force was activated on the 1st of May, 1943, at Peterson Field, Colorado. It was assigned to the 8th Air Force on the 7th of July, 1943, and transferred to a small airfield in Oxfordshire called RAF Mount Farm. From this single airfield, 4 squadrons, the 13th, the 14th, the 22nd, and the 27th, we would fly 4,251 combat sorties over occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945. Together they would produce more than 3 million photographic negatives. The 7th would receive a distinguished unit citation for its work over the Normandy coast between the 31st of May and the 30th of June, 1944. The man who oversaw the American photographic reconnaissance effort in Europe and the Mediterranean was Colonel Elliott Roosevelt, the second son of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a captain in the Army Air Corps from his 30th birthday, the 23rd of September, 1940. He commanded the 3rd Reconnaissance Group in North Africa from late 1942. He led the joint American and British Northwest African Photographic Reconnaissance Wing from February 1943. Under his command, American reconnaissance squadrons pioneered night aerial photography in the European theatre and produced the before and after imagery of Rome's first heavy bombing on the 19th of July, 1943. He was promoted to Brigadier General on the 22nd of January, 1945. In the Pacific, one of the leading early figures was Karl Polifka, who flew some of the first American photo reconnaissance missions of the war out of Townsville, Australia, in the spring of 1942. In the Mediterranean, after Roosevelt moved on to Wing Command, Polifka took over the Northwest African reconnaissance effort. He was widely regarded by his peers as the most aggressive photo recon pilot of the war. But the most important name in the Allied photographic interpretation story may not have been a pilot at all. It was a junior officer of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force named Constance Babington Smith. She had been a journalist before the war, writing for an aviation magazine called The Aeroplane. She knew the silhouettes of German aircraft, the way other women of her generation knew the lines of a dress pattern. She was commissioned in the WAAF in December 1940. By 1941 she was at Medmenham, and by 1943 she was running L section. It was Babington Smith and her colleagues who, in June of 1943, began noticing strange burn marks on the grass at the edge of the runway at Peenemünde, a research site on the Baltic coast of Germany. The burn marks suggested an aircraft engine running on liquid fuel of a kind no-piston engine used. Around the same time, another Medmenham interpreter, Andre Kenny, identified 2 long, thin objects on road trailers at Peenemünde as long-range rockets. They were the first Allied photographic identifications of what the world would later know as the V-2 ballistic missile. The discovery was the product of a hunt that had been running for almost 2 years. As early as 1941, scattered intelligence reports from sources inside occupied Europe had hinted at German rocket research. The Oslo Report, an anonymous package mailed to the British naval attaché in Norway in November 1939, had warned of long-range rockets and other secret weapons. For most of the early war years, the British scientific intelligence officer Reginald Victor Jones had argued that the threat was real. Other officials dismissed it. By the spring of 1943, the evidence had become impossible to dismiss, and the Air Ministry quietly tasked Medmenham with finding what the Germans were building. The interpreters were told to look for, in the words of the briefing, a long-range gun, a remotely controlled rocket aircraft, and some sort of tube out of which a rocket could be squirted. They had no idea at first what any of these things would actually look like from 20,000 feet. On the night of the 17th and 18th of August, 1943, Royal Air Force Bomber Command sent 596 aircraft against Peenemünde in an operation codenamed Hydra. 324 Lancasters, 218 Halifaxes, and 54 Sterlings. The air crews were told they were attacking a radar research site. They were told that if the attack failed, it would be repeated the next night and the night after that, regardless, within practical limits, of casualties. They lost 40 bombers. The British official history later estimated that the raid set the German rocket program back by about 2 months. But the rockets were only half the secret weapon problem. There was something else, something smaller, and something that left a different signature on the ground. On the 28th of November, 1943, a Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft of No. 540 Squadron, flown by squadron leader John Merrifield, with flying officer W.N. Whaley as navigator, photographed Peenemünde West with a 36-inch focal-length camera. The negatives were flown to Medmenham. Babington Smith was given the prints. She placed them under her stereoscope. On one of the inclined ramps near the coast she saw, in 3 dimensions, a small cruciform shape with a stubby fuselage and short straight wings. It was no aircraft she had ever seen. It looked, she said, like a stunted aeroplane. It was the first photographic identification of the Fieseler 103 flying bomb. The world would soon learn to call it the V-1. The Allies acted on her discovery within weeks. Operation Crossbow began on the 23rd of December, 1943. Heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers were thrown against the 96 V-1 launching sites that Memoirs had identified across northern France. By the end of 1943, almost every V-1 launch site detected in France had been bombed flat. The launching of the flying bomb offensive against London was delayed by months, and when it finally began in June of 1944, it came from a new generation of smaller and harder-to-find sites that German engineers had built, precisely because the original sites had been destroyed. This was photographic intelligence at its highest pitch. It was not a single picture, it was a system. The picture was useless without the interpreter. The interpreter was useless without the analytic section. The section was useless without the production line of negatives flowing in every day. And the system as a whole was useless without an air force capable of placing those cameras over enemy territory at will. By the spring of 1944, that was exactly what the Western Allies possessed. By 1945, the daily intake of film at the Allied Central Interpretation Unit averaged 25,000 negatives and 60,000 prints every day. Over the course of the war, the unit produced 36 million prints. In the months around the invasion of France, almost 1,500 intelligence reports and 600,000 prints were being produced every month at Memoirs. By June of 1944, more than 1,700 officers and enlisted personnel were studying 85,000 images a day. The total surviving collection of Allied wartime photo reconnaissance imagery, held today by the National Collection of Aerial Photography in Edinburgh, exceeds 5.5 million prints. These were the eyes. The hands belonged to a different organization. It was called the Army Map Service. The Army Map Service was formed in May of 1942 in Washington by consolidating the Engineer Reproduction Plant, the War Department's map library, and the cartographic section of the War Department General Staff. Between 1941 and 1945, it produced approximately 40,000 different maps, covering 400,000 square miles, in print runs that totaled more than 500 million individual copies. For the North African campaign alone, it produced 1,000 different maps in 10 million copies. For the invasion of Normandy, it produced approximately 3,000 different maps in 70 million copies. The American maps were not produced in isolation. In May of 1942, an agreement was signed between Brigadier Martin Hotin of the British Directorate of Military Survey and Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Loper of the United States Office of the Chief of Engineers. The agreement divided the world's mapping work between the two nations and committed both countries to use the same projections, the same sheet lines, and the same conventional map symbols. From that month on, an American officer in Maryland and a British officer in London were producing one continuous geographic product. The German General Staff was facing a single Anglo-American mapping system, not two competing ones. The deeper innovation, however, was not the conventional map. It was the photomap. A photomap is a controlled photographic mosaic, printed at a known scale, with a coordinate grid and contour lines overprinted on the image. It shows the world as the camera saw it, not as a surveyor remembered it. It can be flown, printed, and distributed within days of the original sortie. It captures hedgerows, individual buildings, fresh earthworks, vehicle tracks, even the boundaries of a freshly cut wheat field. It will reveal a dummy gun, a painted shadow, or a pattern of disturbed soil that no draftsman would ever have drawn. For the invasion of France, photo interpreters at Memoirs built hundreds of precise topographic models, contoured cardboard cutouts overlaid with rubber and topped with the actual aerial imagery for unit rehearsals before D-Day. American and British soldiers walked across miniature versions of the beaches they would land on, weeks before they landed on them. They studied photographs of farmhouses they would later capture. They were issued photomaps that showed the precise field where their parachute would touch the ground. The level of detail in those photomaps would have astonished any pre-war staff officer. A typical Allied beach photomap of Normandy showed every individual obstacle, every wire entanglement, and every tetrahedron and Belgian gate that German engineers had planted in the surf. It showed the exact spacing between gun positions on the bluffs above the beach. It showed the orientation of the embrasures, allowing Allied gunners to calculate which positions could fire on which sectors of the landing beach. It showed access roads, communication trenches, ammunition bunkers, and the dummy gun positions that German camouflage units had built to draw Allied fire. It showed where each minefield had been laid, because the Germans had marked their own minefields with warning signs, which the cameras photographed before the signs could be removed. These prints were not produced in single copies. They were reproduced in the thousands. By the day of the invasion, every assault company commander on every beach had a folder containing photographs of his specific objective, taken from multiple angles, at multiple altitudes, on multiple dates. Soldiers in the second and third waves had folders showing them what the same ground would look like once the first wave had gone through it. Pilots had photomaps strapped to their thighs showing the rivers and rail lines along their approach to the dropping zones. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, dropped behind the beaches in the early hours of the 6th of June, had been studying for weeks the photographs of the specific Norman fields where each parachute battalion was meant to assemble. This was the apparatus. Now we must turn to the men it was being used against, and to the question of why they could not match it. The German military intelligence system was not staffed by fools. The German General Staff was the most professional military planning institution in Europe. The German army had pioneered the modern staff officer in the 1800s. German cartography, German photogrammetry, and German optical industry were among the most advanced in the world. The names Zeiss, Leica, and Bausch and Lomb tell you everything about the centrality of German lens-making to the field. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had performed sophisticated aerial reconnaissance against Poland, France, the Low Countries, and the Soviet Union. By the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons had photographed almost every important target inside the Western Soviet Union. But by 1944, this entire German apparatus was struggling under a set of compounding handicaps that the Western Allies were not. The first handicap was institutional. German military intelligence was fragmented across rival agencies that did not always cooperate. Military intelligence, in the strict sense, belonged to an organization called the Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Foreign Army intelligence was divided between two sections of the Army General Staff. Foreign Armies West, under Colonel Alexis von Roen from 1943 onward, watched the Western Allies. Foreign Armies East, under Lieutenant Colonel Reinhard Gehlen from the 1st of April, 1942, watched the Soviets. Air intelligence belonged to the Luftwaffe Operations Staff IC. Signals intelligence was scattered among multiple agencies. There was no German Medmenham. There was no Central Allied Central Interpretation Unit equivalent. Each air fleet ran its own photo interpretation, often to different standards. The second handicap was doctrinal. According to the National Collection of Aerial Photography, the curators today of the surviving German Air Force imagery, the German interpretation effort was hampered by being decentralized. The photographic interpreters were often poorly trained, and German units generally disregarded the use of stereoscopes to view images in 3 dimensions. This meant that a German interpreter, looking at a print of an Allied airfield, would see a flat photograph. An interpreter at Medmenham, looking at the same print, would see a 3-dimensional model in which a shadow that didn't match its building, or a vehicle track that didn't match its supposed surface, would jump out instantly. By 1944, this was not a small advantage. It was an analytical chasm. The third handicap, and ultimately the decisive one, was that the German Air Force could no longer fly the missions on which everything else depended. By the early summer of 1944, the Western Allies had achieved overwhelming air superiority over France, the Low Countries, and increasingly over Germany itself. The numbers tell the story. On the 5th of June, 1944, the day before the Allied invasion of Normandy, the entire fighting strength of Air Fleet 3, the German air formation responsible for the defense of France and the Low Countries, was 481 aircraft. Of these, only 64 were reconnaissance aircraft. Only 100 were single-engine fighters. Against this, the Western Allies arrayed approximately 2,100 4-engine bombers, 600 2-engine bombers, and between 3,500 and 4,000 single-engine fighters and fighter bombers. From dawn to dusk on the day of the invasion, between 400 and 600 Allied fighters operated continuously over the Normandy battlefield. In this environment, German aerial reconnaissance over Allied territory had collapsed to almost nothing. A few high-altitude sorties were flown in Junkers 88 and Junkers 188 aircraft. Toward the end of the war, a handful of jet-powered Arado 2, 3, 4 reconnaissance aircraft flew sorties that the Allies could not intercept, but the volume was so small and the analysis behind it so thin that the imagery added little to the German understanding of Allied dispositions. The contrast in tactical effects was visible in any sector of the front. When an Allied division moved a battalion into the line, the move was screened from German air observation by Allied fighters that prevented enemy aircraft from approaching the area. When a German division moved a battalion into the line, the move was photographed within hours by Allied tactical reconnaissance, identified by the interpreters at the corresponding Air Force-level interpretation unit, and passed to the Corps and Army intelligence officers who would brief the relevant Allied commander the next morning. The Allied commander could then move his artillery to fire on a position before the German battalion had finished digging in. German divisional commanders learned to march at night. They learned to hide in forests during the day. They learned that any vehicle column caught in the open by daylight in good weather was, in practice, a column of casualties waiting to happen. The American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, the British Hawker Typhoon, and the rocket-firing variants of both had become the air-to-ground extension of the camera. What the camera saw, the fighter bomber struck. What the fighter bomber struck, the camera then rephotographed for damage assessment. Worse, the few German reconnaissance flights that did still get through were being deliberately deceived. The British double-cross system and Operation Fortitude were running on the simple insight that what German intelligence could see, German intelligence would believe. Allied counterintelligence ensured that German reconnaissance aircraft were carefully allowed to photograph a fictitious invasion build-up in southeast England, aimed at the Pas de Calais. They were not allowed to photograph the real concentrations of troops and shipping in the West Country, aimed at Normandy. The deception worked because the German air arm could not check it. There was no second sortie to confirm or contradict the first. There was only the picture the Allies wanted them to see. The result, at the level of an army group commander, was a kind of operational blindness that the German General Staff had never previously experienced. Nobody understood this better than the commander of Army Group B, the most famous field marshal Germany possessed, Erwin Rommel. From late 1943 onward, Rommel was responsible for the defense of the French coast. He was also one of the very few senior German commanders who had experienced Allied air power at full strength in the deserts of North Africa in 1942 and 1943. He knew what the Allied air arm could do to a column of moving vehicles. He had watched his own Africa Corps battered by Allied air, ground, and naval power working in combination. Rommel concluded that the only way to defeat an Allied invasion was to defeat it on the beaches in the first hours, before Allied air power could destroy any German counterattack. His Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Friedrich Rüge, recorded Rommel's reasoning in a memoir published after the war. Rommel said that under ordinary circumstances, the orthodox plan of holding the panzer divisions inland for a great mobile counterstroke would be quite all right, but it would not work in view of the enemy air supremacy. Rommel was the only general with recent experience in that field. He expected that any German attempt at large-scale mobile operations would be broken up or critically delayed from the air. He also understood that the much-advertised Atlantic Wall was not what the German propaganda ministry claimed. In private correspondence in 1944, Rommel called the Atlantic Wall a figment of Hitler's cloud cuckoo land. He called it an enormous bluff, more for the German people than for the enemy. The commander of the German 15th Army, General Hans von Salmuth, said the same thing in plainer language. He wrote that the Atlantic Wall was no wall, but rather a thin and fragile cord with a few small knots at isolated places. The reason the wall was a bluff was, in part, that the Western Allies knew where every knot in that cord was located. They had photographs of every gun emplacement, every machine gun pit, every minefield, every hedgehog, and every Belgian gate on the beaches at low tide. They had this because of a series of low-altitude flights so dangerous that they were nicknamed dicing missions, dicing with death. In the weeks before D-Day, pilots of the 10th Photographic Group of the 9th Air Force, in particular the 30th, 31st, and 34th Photographic Reconnaissance Squadrons, flew a series of these low-altitude sorties along the coast of northern France. They flew F-5 Lightnings, stripped to a fighting weight, single ship, at altitudes that observers later described as below the level of the cliffs they were photographing. They flew in along the line of obstacles that German engineers had been planting in the surf at low tide. Their cameras photographed each obstacle in detail, clear enough for an Allied engineer to identify the type of explosive charge attached to it. The 30th Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron received a distinguished unit citation for these missions over Utah Beach. Lieutenant Albert Lanker of the 31st Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron and Lieutenant Garland York of the 34th flew some of the most famous dicing sorties, including a low-altitude run on the 20th of May, 1944, that captured large parts of the future Omaha and Utah Beach defenses in a single mission. Brigadier General George Goddard, a senior figure in American military aerial photography, visited several reconnaissance stations in England in the days surrounding the invasion. He recorded what he saw. Reconnaissance aircraft were landing and taking off continually. Crews were dashing into the photographic laboratories with their freshly exposed film magazines. Messengers were running the prints to the intelligence sections. Around the clock, thousands of photographs were being produced, without a hitch in the entire operation. While this was happening, on the German side of the channel, Field Marshal Rommel was driving home to celebrate his wife's birthday. He believed, on the basis of the weather forecast, that no invasion was possible in the first week of June. He did not have, and could not have, current aerial photography of the English ports. The pattern that began at Normandy continued through the rest of the war in the West. Allied photo reconnaissance overflew the Ruhr, identifying targets for the strategic bombing campaign and assessing the damage afterwards. The breached Moni and Edda dams after the Royal Air Force raid in May 1943 were photographed within hours in some of the most famous reconnaissance images of the war. The German aircraft industry, the synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Politz, the rail marshalling yards, the U-boat pens on the French Atlantic coast, all were under continuous observation. The strategic bombing campaign, whose effectiveness was later debated for decades, was at every moment guided by photographic intelligence. There was, however, one moment in the war in the West when the Allied photographic system did not deliver, and it is important to be honest about it. In the autumn of 1944, Adolf Hitler personally authored a plan for a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, was the titular senior commander, but the plan was Hitler's own, and Rundstedt privately considered it folly. The offensive was launched on the 16th of December, 1944. It achieved complete operational surprise. The Allies were caught off guard. American units were overrun in the opening hours. The bulge that the German attack drove into the Allied line gave the battle its popular name. The conventional explanation has often been that bad weather during the first half of December had blinded Allied air reconnaissance over the German staging areas. This is partly true and partly misleading. According to the official United States Army history of the Ardennes campaign, in the month before the German attack, the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group of the 9th Tactical Air Command, supporting the 1st United States Army, flew 361 missions, of which 242 were judged successful. Allied reconnaissance pilots reported a drastic increase in German rail activity west of the Rhine on the 30th of November, 1944. They saw flat cars carrying tanks. They saw 50 searchlights moving forward. The intelligence officer of General George Patton's Third Army, Colonel Oskar Koch, drew the correct conclusion from this and other evidence. On the 9th of December, 1944, 1 week before the offensive began, Koch told Patton that the Germans were preparing a major counter-offensive. Patton, characteristically, said afterwards that he ought to know what he was doing because he had the best damned intelligence officer in any United States command. But Koch's view did not carry at higher headquarters. Allied senior intelligence officers above corps level concluded that the Germans were incapable of a major offensive. The photographs were collected. They were not believed. After the war, General Dwight Eisenhower himself wrote that a shocking deficiency that impeded all constructive planning had existed in the field of intelligence, and that the stepchild position of the intelligence staff in the American General Staff system had been emphasized in many ways. This is a sharper lesson than the simple story of Allied vision and German blindness. Photographic collection without honest analysis is just paper. A camera that is not believed is not an intelligence system. The Battle of the Bulge was, in this sense, the one moment in the campaign in the West when the Allies experienced a small taste of what their German adversaries lived with every day. It came as a shock. It was corrected within weeks. By late January 1945, the Allied photographic and analytical system was fully operational again, and Germany would not achieve another strategic surprise for the rest of the war. For the German General Staff, however, no such recovery was possible. The asymmetry of vision had become a structural feature of the war. The reconnaissance aircraft were lost. The pilots were lost. The fuel was lost. The spare parts were lost. In the east, foreign armies east under Reinhard Gehlen tried to compensate with prisoner interrogation, signals intelligence, and battlefield observation, and to a remarkable extent succeeded in producing usable order of battle estimates of the Red Army. In the west, foreign armies west under Alexis von Rohen could not even do that. The French resistance suppressed German agent networks. Allied signals, security, and the ultra operation against the German Enigma cipher meant that the Germans could not read Allied radio traffic, while the Allies were reading theirs. The double agents under British control fed German intelligence the information the Allies wanted them to receive. And above it all, the cameras of Mount Farm and Benson and the other Allied reconnaissance bases continued their daily work. What did this look like, at the end, to the men on the German side? The most direct evidence comes from a series of documents written after the war, when captured German generals and staff officers were placed in American custody and asked to record their experience. These were the European Theatre Historical Interrogations, the so-called ETHINT papers, and the Foreign Military Studies P-series. They were prepared between 1945 and 1954 under the supervision of the United States Army Historical Division. They cover virtually every senior German commander still alive at the end of the war. They are some of the most candid documents written by any defeated military leadership in modern history. In paper after paper, the same theme appears. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel discusses the invasion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt describes the planning of the Ardennes offensive. Colonel General Alfred Jodl explains the operational planning at the High Command of the Armed Forces. General of Artillery Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the High Command Operations Staff, traces the strategic situation from the invasion to the Siegfried Line. SS General Paul Hauser describes the experience of the 7th Army. The vocabulary differs, but the substance is the same. The decisive constraint on every German operational plan from the summer of 1944 onward was the assumption that the enemy could see what the Germans were doing, and that the Germans could not see what the enemy was doing. This single assumption shaped every German decision in the West. It was why the Ardennes offensive was launched only when bad weather promised to ground Allied tactical aircraft. It was why German formations moved by night and hid by day. It was why the German army made repeated attempts to develop better camouflage, including elaborate fake tank tracks, painted shadows, and netting that mimicked vegetation. It was why every German staff in France, in the months before the invasion, knew that their deployments were being photographed, but did not know which of those photographs the enemy was actually using. There is one more story to be told, and it belongs at the end. It is the story of what happened to the German photographic effort itself. The German Air Force had, between 1939 and 1943, taken an enormous number of aerial photographs, especially over Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union. The total surviving collection of these images today, held jointly by the United States National Archives and the National Collection of Aerial Photography in Edinburgh, and comes to roughly 2.5 million prints. They were stored, during the war, at multiple sites across the Reich. As the Reich collapsed in April and May of 1945, the question for the Western Allies became whether they could find the German photographs before the Soviets did, before the German archive officers destroyed them, and before the chaos of the surrender swallowed them. The mission was given to the 325th Photographic Wing, the 8th Air Force Command formed under Elliott Roosevelt at RAF High Wycombe in 1944. The code name for the overall search was Project Turban. Its sub-projects had names like Dick Tracy for material recovered around Berchtesgaden, Orwell for material from Vienna, Monthly for material from Oslo, and Tennant for material from Berlin. The single most spectacular discovery came in late April of 1945, in a barn near the Bavarian town of Bad Reichenhall, where American search teams found roughly 800,000 German photographic prints in metal canisters. By the time the search projects were complete, approximately 20 tons of imagery had been recovered from 11 separate sites across former German territory. The prints were flown to Medmenham in June of 1945. Preliminary sorting and indexing continued at the Allied Central Interpretation Unit until 1949. The archive that resulted was extraordinary. It contained Luftwaffe photographs of large parts of European Russia, the Caucasus, Poland, Ukraine, and the Balkans, taken at a time when the Soviet Union was at war and could not have known that any of it was being recorded. After 1947, as the Cold War took shape, this German imagery became a Western intelligence asset of incalculable value. It provided the only available photographic coverage of vast areas of the Soviet Union for the next 15 years, until the first successful American Corona reconnaissance satellite mission in August of 1960 made fresh imagery possible. The men who had once been hunted by the Luftwaffe were now profiting, in intelligence terms, from the Luftwaffe's own work. The Allied photographic archive itself survives. The collection of the Allied Central Interpretation Unit, roughly 5.5 million prints, is held today by the National Collection of Aerial Photography in Edinburgh. The collection of the Mediterranean Allied Photographic Reconnaissance Wing, around 150,000 prints, is held there as well. Approximately 1.2 million captured German prints are held at the National Archives in Maryland in Record Group 373. The full institutional records of the Army Map Service passed in succession to the Defense Mapping Agency, then to the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, and finally, since 2003, to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The personal records survive too. The papers of Constance Babington Smith are scattered between archives in Britain and the United States. In 2015, 15 years after her death, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency inducted her into its Hall of Fame. The 7th photo group is commemorated by a memorial at the village of Berrinsfield in Oxfordshire, built in the early 1960s, on the western end of what had once been RAF Mount Farm. The Medmenham collection, maintained by the Medmenham Club, preserves the memory of the photo interpreters who worked at Danesfield House. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel did not live to read the post-war reports. He committed suicide on the 14th of October, 1944, after being implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Vice Admiral Friedrich Rüge, his naval chief of staff, survived the war and rose to senior rank in the post-war West German Navy, where he wrote his memoir of the months before Normandy. Reinhard Gehlen surrendered to the Americans, handed over his Foreign Army's East files, and went on to become the founding head of West German intelligence. Alexis von Rohan, the head of Foreign Armies West, was hanged on the 12th of October, 1944, for his role in the July plot. Walter Warlimont was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment, and released in 1957. Alfred Jodl was hanged on the 16th of October, 1946, after the main Nuremberg trial. Constance Babington Smith returned to writing. She produced a memoir of her wartime work, called Evidence in Camera, published in 1957, and reissued under the title Air Spy. She lived until the year 2000. Elliot Roosevelt left the army on the day the war ended, the 15th of August, 1945. Karl Polifka was killed in action over Korea on the 1st of July, 1951, when his reconnaissance aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire near Kaesong. The Lockheed F-5 Lightnings were broken up for scrap. The Mosquitoes rotted in damp British weather. The cameras went to surplus. The Trimetragon mounts were dismantled. The country house at Medmenham reverted to private use. The grass airfield at Mount Farm was sold by the Air Ministry in 1957, and its runways were progressively dismantled in the years that followed. Within a decade of the war's end, the visible apparatus of the great Allied photographic effort had vanished from the landscape. But what the apparatus had done to the war did not vanish. The German staffs were not stupid. They were not poorly trained. They were not lacking in courage or in professional skill. They were beaten by an asymmetry of information that grew year by year, until by 1944 it could no longer be closed. They were beaten because the enemy could fly when they could not, photograph when they could not, interpret with stereoscopes when they did not, and print 70 million map sheets for a single campaign, while the German General Staff was still working from the maps of an earlier war. The men and women who built that asymmetry paid for it. The pilots of the 7th Photo Group and its sister units, flying unarmed and alone over defended targets, paid in lives. The dicing pilots who skimmed the Normandy cliffs paid in lives. The interpreters who sat 10 hours a day with stereoscopes pressed to their eyes paid in eyesight, and sometimes in nerves. The lieutenant developing film in a Quonset hut at Mount Farm at 3 in the morning, the sergeant in Maryland printing his 60 millionth map sheet, the young woman at Medmenham noticing the shape of an aircraft that should not have existed. All of them were doing the same quiet work, and all of them paid in the same currency of effort and loss. In the end, the camera proved as decisive a weapon of the war as the rifle, the tank, or the bomber. The Germans had built one of those weapons. They had not built the camera system. By the time they understood what had been done to them, the war was over. The prints were in Allied archives, and the long memory of military intelligence had begun. The negatives are catalogued. The stereoscopes sit in museum cases. The men and women who took the photographs and read them are almost all gone. The photographs themselves outlived almost everyone in the story. They are what the camera always was, in the end. They are evidence. They are the part of war that does not lie and does not forget.